if you haven't noticed, both the Democrats and the Republicans hate big tech, right? It's becoming this catch-all phrase. And they also both hate this sort of subcategory under big tech, which is Section 230. And essentially, they hate it for very different reasons, but like they both agree it needs to go or be severely modified. So last week, the House Energy Committee held this hearing. I'm going to put hearing in quotations because it was actually just like a straight hit job. They held a 7-hour hearing where they did not have one witness called who was in favor of Section 230. Like that should tell you.
Very balanced.
Very
fair.
Balanced. Yes, totally fair. They definitely wanted to get to the bottom of things. And they both have really different agendas. So I've watched about 5 hours of the 7 hours and I was like, capped out on my like anger for the day. So I had to leave the last 2 hours. But basically, Democrats essentially think that social media companies should censor people more. They think they should be liable for what people write. They think that they should be held accountable for misinformation. They think that the government should be able to come in and tell them how to moderate their content for this reason. And they mostly want to do it around things like COVID and vaccines and climate change because they don't think that people should be able to write things that go against the public narrative around that they've crafted. The right hates it for very other, weird reasons. Like they basically feel like they're being moderated too much, that they're being censored, that the government's colluding with social media to censor them, which I would say is valid. But Republicans are like,
true.
Yeah, they're not wrong that that's happening. But then they're like, so we think that the government should have more control over content moderation for social media. And they both have kind of identified that Section 230, getting rid of it, would help them reach those end goals. I want to be very, very clear because there is a wild amount of misinformation out there about Section 230, and it is not hard to actually figure out the truth. This is one of those issues where I'm like, I actually don't even give you a pass if you're out there being like, well, there's a difference in platform publishers. No, there's not. Go read the bill. It is literally like under 1,000 words long. It was not that long ago. It was written. The person who passed it is still in the House and gives interviews on it all the time. Like, you can figure this out for yourself. Quit listening to the politicians and go read it. All Section 230 says, and this is so simple, is that when the internet was created, they wanted to make sure that the courts didn't have to waste their time figuring out what was a First Amendment violation and what was not. And they feared that in this new age of the internet, businesses that were online, if they had somebody write something on their platforms and their comment section, wherever it was, that they might be held liable. There would be a question if they were liable. Now, people could sue them. It would go to the court. And most likely, the First Amendment would say that they were not liable. But what happens? Those companies have to pay to defend themselves. And so that's something that would really prohibit growth. It would stomp out small companies before they could ever get going. It was not a smart structure. It would also bog up our courts with a lot of frivolous lawsuits. And so they said, we're just going to go ahead and write Section 230 to basically clarify that, yes, the First Amendment means this, which it does. And they passed it. And for the longest time, nobody ever questioned it because it's the most common sense law in the world. It literally just says that online companies are not liable for what other people write on them, period. So that's what we end up with when Trump comes around in 2016, 2017. He gets kicked off Twitter and he decides that Section 230 is to blame, which to this day makes no sense. I really just think Section 230 is how you attack the First Amendment when you know you can't attack the First Amendment.
I mean, he would. Let me get this. Let me see if I have this right, though. If they had been responsible for his content legally all along, wouldn't he have been kicked off Twitter like years ago?
Yes, like a while back. And so would a lot more people. We've already seen some of this applied when companies have had some kind of threat of that, where they start moderating more. They kick more people off. They even take away comment sections, because even if they would end up winning in court, again, they'd still have to pay to defend themselves. Who knows if they'd get damages because of the way our court system's structured. You don't always even get that. You can be frivolously sued. You can get slap lawsuits. All kinds of things can go down that can actually financially hurt you, even if you're in the right, even if you win. And so it wouldn't have solved a single thing for Trump. Like, he almost certainly would have been kicked off sooner. And so would a lot more people if they got rid of it. And so people...
It always just makes sense to me, the idea of Section 230, because it's like, if I write a book and my book has a bunch of like potentially libelous things in it, should the paper company be sued? I mean, that's basically what I think of digital platforms. Like, when I tweet something, I'm saying it. I should be responsible for my words, not Twitter. And I agree with you. There's a lot of misinformation about Section 230, misunderstandings. People think that it requires companies to be politically neutral to receive the liability protections. It does not. It says they can remove any objectionable material that they don't want to host. And also, it's like, even if they were to insert some like neutrality requirement, it's probably unconstitutional. But even if it wasn't, you really want the government deciding what's neutral? I mean, the average federal bureaucrat has the politics of Elizabeth Warren. I don't really want them deciding what speech is allowed online and what speech isn't. What were these people at Congress even like saying in order to try to push this? Because I'm genuinely curious what their arguments are.
Okay, so let's pull a couple clips because they were pretty different. I've got one from a Republican. I'll let you play that first.
Big tech has broken my trust. Big tech has failed to uphold the fundamental American principle, free speech and expression. Big tech platforms like Twitter and Facebook used to provide a promising platform for free speech and robust debates, but they no longer operate as public squares. They do not promote the battle of ideas. They actively work against it. They shut down free speech and censor any viewpoint that does not fit their liberal ideology. And big tech has exploited and harmed our children. In our March hearing with the CEOs, I asked the big tech companies why they deserve liability protections Congress provided for them more than 20 years ago. Unfortunately, their behavior has not improved.
So my issue with what she said is multiple. I have multiple issues. First and foremost, private companies do not owe you free speech. They do not owe you a marketplace of ideas. They do not owe you any of these ideas. Do we want them to? Of course, I want them to, and I try to frequent companies that do live up to those values. But if a company wants to form in this country and be like a commie fringe organization, you don't give up your right to be political just because you own a business. You don't give up your right to free speech because you own a business. And to be clear, free speech is only something that you are given between you and the government. And business owners often also have that between them and the government. And it means the government cannot force you to say something, and it also cannot force you to not say something. And so in trying to come in and say, you must host this speech that you disagree with, if you're the government, as these witnesses are, you have no authority. That is an actual violation of free speech. Whereas Facebook and Twitter maybe don't uphold a culture of free speech, but they're not actually violating the First Amendment.
Yeah, I definitely think you're right as far as the First Amendment goes. Like, the legal part of free speech does not apply to Twitter or Facebook. But, I'm sympathetic to some of what the Congresswoman says here. I don't really think it's her role as a member of Congress or the government to be doing this. But Facebook and Twitter, if you go back to their founding and what their executives have said, they have promised users that they would be like digital marketplaces of ideas and have robust speech and argument and debates. And I agree with you absolutely that they have the right to delete whatever they want and they have that First Amendment right. But I think it's okay to bash them for like being extremely absurd with how they do it, extremely biased with how they do it. I mean, like, Twitter censored the New York Post story about Hunter Biden because they were afraid it would hurt Sleepy Joe in the election. Story turned out to be true, but they claimed it was all disinformation. I mean, these issues, TikTok took down one of my videos. We talked about this, right? It always goes in one direction. And I am sympathetic to that bias. And I think it's fair for us to say, like, do better and push back on these companies. But yeah, I definitely agree with you on two things. One is that they still have the right to do it. And second is that the government really has no business in this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think at the end of the day, that is the free market. We should push back. We should raise our voices. We should use other companies. We should try to find ways to incentivize them to move away from those policies. And I ultimately think that while there are problems with it, and yes, it does tend to go in one direction, I also think that they're not going to go too far in one direction because they will lose, 50% of their market. No smart business person would do that. And that actually is the benefit of a free market, right? Like, companies are still accountable to people. Maybe they'd be more accountable to people if they had fewer government protections, which I think is so interesting, Brad. Like, guess who also wants to get rid of Section 230? Facebook.
One of the industry insiders.
Yeah, Facebook is running this mega advocacy campaign. I don't even know what they're paying for. Every time I listen to the New York Times every morning, Facebook has an ad in there basically saying, like, we agree Section 230 needs to be modified. Why do they want to do that? Because Facebook can afford the frivolous lawsuits that would get thrown at it, but they know that their competitors could not. And so this is just an excellent example of two things. One, most of the time, regulations are crafted by industry insiders. People in Congress don't know how to craft these regulations. They don't know the industry well enough. What was that weird congressman the other week who was like slamming his hand, like, are you going to get rid of FISTA? And the Facebook CEO was like, that's literally just accountants people start. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so they aren't capable of actually coming in and writing this language. So who does? The regulatory state is mostly made up of industry insiders who come in and craft these regulations to benefit them and to ensure that their smaller competitors cannot ever actually compete in the market with them. And this is a really crony practice that leads to all kinds of issues. We see it in almost every situation where regulations are being implemented, and Facebook is no exception. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that this is what they're trying to push.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing like when Amazon pushes and lobbies for a $15 minimum wage. Like, why are they doing that? They're doing that because they specifically know that their small, mom and pop retail competitors can't afford that cost, but they can. It's not great for them in the short run, but if it gets a bunch of their competitors out of the business and helps them consolidate market share, then they love regulation. They love big government. One of the misconceptions that people have is that big business is anti-big government. That's not true. They are pro crony capitalism, right? They're into regulations and subsidies when it can be used by their lobbyists. I get those Facebook ads too, and every time my red flag goes up, because hold on, they told me that regulating big tech would be good for the people and bad for the corporate oligarchs. And I'm like, well, then why are they literally spamming me with ads promoting this? Like, it's a giant red flag, and it should be your first sign that these big government regulations are not going to help you, sweetie. They're not, because it's not as if you and I have lobbyists in DC who help, write rules and bill text. But Facebook has an army of lobbyists, right? Like Microsoft, Twitter, Google, all these companies. If you think that legislative solutions are going to make them, better Americans on how we wish they might be, you're just hopelessly naive.
Which brings me to my second point that just it blows my mind, which is that Republicans who are pushing for modification or repeal of Section 230 are largely kind of being like useful idiots to the left's agenda right now, because at the end of the day, the left does have an agenda here. And I promise you it's to have more control of these companies. I want to play another clip from the hearing, this time from a Democrat. So let's roll that.
The real problem I see is that big tech's primary focus is to make money. And I know we have a market economy, and that's always a company's primary purpose. But they give the impression to the public that they care about content, values, and have a social purpose, that somehow they care about consumers of the First Amendment, and they have some value to the consumer or to the public. And I hope that continues to be true. But if it is, then they should be held accountable to achieve these goals. You can't go out and say, I'm not primarily focused on making money, I want to help people, but then not be accountable for these bad actions.
So as you can see, right from the bat, he's actually attacking the idea that companies are in business to make money. Like, how dare they? And that you have a market at all. Yeah. And he's also saying, and this is something that got repeated throughout the hearing by Democrats, that like social media is a dangerous place for kids. And it's like, oh, maybe just parent your kids and keep them off social media, you weirdo. Like, I think that should be within your purview, but they don't. They want the government to come in and basically parent their kids for them. And ultimately what these Democrats want is they want themselves to have more power over these social media companies. And we already know to what extent they would want to use that power. And it actually is to censor more right-leaning ideas and to actually stifle free speech. And so then Republicans come along and they're like, yeah, get rid of Section 230. It's like, you are actually giving them and these big businesses exactly what they want. If you hate big tech, if you don't think the left should be colluding with social media companies to censor you or decide what kind of content gets posted, the last thing you should want is for the government to have any more control over these companies. And certainly you should not want them to get rid of Section 230. Like, this is the problem when people try to participate in politics without doing their due diligence to actually research for themselves and know what they're talking about before they show up and start voting. And it actually drives me nuts, because mess around and find out what happens. It's less of a free market. It's less civil liberties. It's less actual freedom. And we don't end up here just because the left is really good at playing chess and moving the needle. No, we end up here because the right sells out the minute things aren't going their way and throws the free market under the bus. And I'm sick of it.
But no, Hannah, it will be different when we do it. When we have the power, it will all work out. The smart people the right people will be in charge this time.
Exactly. As long as the Republicans are in power for 2 years and they're the ones moderating the content, why do we have to worry about that?
Well, what's crazy to me is that both Joe Biden and Donald Trump ran on anti-230 platforms in 2020. And it's like these two dudes agree on almost nothing. But when you're both, the dusty old Democrat septuagenarian who's lost so many steps that it's like 15 stories at this point, and Trump, right, who everybody has lots of thoughts on, when they both agree on something, that should be your first red flag that, like, this is not good.
That's right. I think it's problematic. And again, I mean, my main takeaway is like, wake up, people. Come on. You're getting played. Stop getting played. It's not that hard to like pay attention to what's going on here.